Good morning, everybody, and welcome to April's Yardstick webinar, when we are joined, as we'll see in a moment, by Rory Sutherland. Rory, welcome, Rory. Thank you for coming on and sparing an hour of your time with us.
It's a pleasure. Pleasure to be here.
Dan, let's go straight into some housekeeping, if that's okay, because as everybody who's been to Yardstick webinars before, we're always joined by Abby and Dan. To help us along the way. Dan, do you just want to do a bit of housekeeping and explain how we're going to do things today, if that's all right?
Sure thing. So I'm Dan. I'm the head of branding and design here at the Yardstick Agency. So what do we all need to know for today's session? Well, to start with, we have a number of fresh faces in the crowd looking at the names here. So I guess welcome to your first Yardstick webinar. And of course, the familiar faces among you will know that we encourage questions, engagement, general opinions, and disagreements. Keep them classy, of course. So get stuck in. Phil will lead with his own questions today, but I'll be picking up plenty of your questions to ask Rory. And you can do that by using the Q&A box or the chat. I'll be monitoring both, and I'll read some out at regular intervals. And depending on where we end up in 60 minutes time, we'll sweep up as many as we can before we all have to wave goodbye. Now, this is a safe space, really safe. We're all here to learn, and there's no such thing as a daft question. I mean, Rory might disagree, of course, but throw it out there, throw it forward, and let's see how we get on. And finally, no doubt you'll want to rewatch this. So Yardstick's very own Abby Robinson will be tirelessly working behind the scenes to make sure that a follow-up email with a recording of today's session and any notes or resources we mention will be sent out later today. Now, this is the part where I switch from being a panelist to an audience member and make way for Phil Bray and Rory Sutherland.
Cheers, Dan. So, Rory, for anybody who's been living under a rock and hasn't read your book with a fantastic cover, I love the picture on the cover, and didn't hear you on your famous TED Talks or with Stephen Bartlett on the Diary of a CEO podcast, just give us a bit of your background, if that's okay, for a couple of minutes, Rory. Introduce yourself to the audience today.
Yes, I have a very boring career path, which is I've joined Ogilvy as a graduate trainee in 1988, and I've been there ever since, although in completely different job functions. So it's not quite as monotonous as it seems. I also write for The Spectator, and I write for Wired and other publications. And I suppose really the central sort of insight I have is that life consists, and business even more so, consist of two complementary components. And we're ever more and more focused on one of them to the detriment of the other. And so a very simple thing, which I always talk about, and apologies to people who've heard it before, if you look at bees have, I mean the insects, bees have developed a really clever little mechanism, which is, it's called the Waggle dance. And they do a little dance to tell other bees where to go to find known pre-existing sources of pollen and nectar and water, I think. It might be resin. They collect about 3 or 4 different things. And they tell the other bees where to go. And the direction they dance, I think, relative to the vertical, tells the bees the direction in relation to the position of the sun in which they should head and what distance they should travel for to find this wonderful pre-existing source of nectar. And the length of the dance, by the way, is a representative of the quality of the available resources. Now, that's not because the bees have a stopwatch and they go, oh, he's danced for 36 seconds, it must be really good. It's because the longer you dance, the more bees see your dance and the more bees head off in that direction. So it's a kind of brilliant built-in feedback loop. And as that resource gets depleted, they dance for less and less time. And so fewer bees go off then to pursue a diminishing resource. It's beautiful. But the thing that astonished bee scientists was that it varies, obviously, according to a whole range of factors. But about 20% of bees ignore the Waggle dance and they just go off at random. And at first they thought, this is very, very strange. Why would you develop this brilliant sort of process and then allow, bees have been around for 20 million years, a lot longer than humans. How come we haven't kind of evolved bee compliance officers, which demand 100% adherence to the Waggle dance, to meet our nectar collection target for Q3? And they thought this was very strange. And then someone modeled it as a complex system and realized that if you don't have a certain amount of randomness and exploration, they're called scout bees. If you don't invest in scout bees, you become over optimized. You get trapped in a local maximum. You get over optimized on the past, and eventually you starve to death because you become obsessed with exploiting what you know, not with discovering what you don't yet know or discovering what's changed. And now, to work, by the way, the scout bees, obviously, when they find something new, they have to share the finding. What this means is that the hive can adapt over time when the environment changes, very similar to a business. In business, the environment changes. It also means that it has a certain degree of resilience because you're not over-dependent on one particular source of energy. Let's imagine you had a brilliant field, everybody just went to this field, and then some cows break in and they eat all the flowers. Well, at that point, where do you go next? You're dead. And so they realized that the hives that actually over-optimized on exploiting what they knew effectively don't exist anymore because they went extinct. Now, there's a similar, it's known in computer algorithm design as the explore-exploit trade-off. The trade-off between exploiting the data you have and exploring the data you don't. Now, you can see this pattern. Detective work, for example, in a sense, there's the investigative phase, which is we don't yet know enough, we don't even know who did it. And then you might say there's the kind of evidential phase where you compile the evidence and you build it up for a court of law to be convincing. There's this trade-off effectively between open-ended questions and then effectively optimizing then what your answer. And it is called the explore-exploit trade-off, even though it isn't really a trade-off. They're two complementary parts of the whole. And what I'd say is that in business, and partly because of the dominance of economics and finance and procurement and other kind of reductionist, and I'd say management consulting, we've become obsessed with optimizing efficiency at the expense of exploring possibility. And the innovation, scout bees, will, to the uninitiated, look like an inefficiency. Okay, they don't have 100. If you imagine the obedient bees probably look at the scout bees and get a bunch of dilettantes. The last 5 journeys they went on, they didn't come back with anything. Okay, but that's not the point. One time in 100, those scout bees come back with a fantastic, game-changing discovery. And if you don't get the ratio right, I think something goes wrong. Now, I talk a lot about trains, and my argument is, yes, when you're building a railway like High Speed 2, you will need a load of engineers. Should you get the engineers on their own to actually plan and define the role of the railway? And I'd argue, the question I'd ask is, what would High Speed 2 look like if the initial brief had been given to Disney and not to, say, large engineering firms and consultancies, or economists for that matter? Now, economists define the role of HS2. Economists, by the way, always assume pre-existing demand. They assume that people only do the things they want to do, and therefore your job is to deliver that as efficiently and as cheaply as possible. Now, Disney doesn't work like that. Disney goes, how do we create something from nothing? Now, what is undoubtedly true is if you've given the brief for Disney, when you give the brief for High Speed 2 to a bunch of engineers, they define success as transports X people in Y time between central London and central Manchester, say. And they look at capacity, they look at speed, they look at frequency of service, they look at punctuality, all the things you can quantify and measure. I would argue that Disney, now bear in mind, Disney did something much more remarkable than any train company, because train companies simply got people to go to places they already wanted to go to. Disney has got hundreds of millions of people to go to Orlando, right? Not by providing transport infrastructure, but by providing a reason to go to Orlando. if you believe there's a reason to go to Orlando. Disney created it. Now, this is the way Disney would have framed the brief is different. Disney would have framed the brief as, how do we make the journey between London and Manchester so enjoyable, A, that people who didn't want to go to Manchester end up going to Manchester anyway because they want the journey, and B, you might ask the question, how do we make the train journey between London and Manchester so enjoyable that people feel stupid taking the car? That's the real question you should be asking. But economists and engineers aren't asking that question. They're asking the question in purely kind of utilitarian, operational terms. And as a consequence, there's a massive opportunity cost in lost imaginative problem solving. And I think there's something really interesting there, because I think there is the potential for magic, but economics doesn't believe in it. Now, here's a really interesting case in point which proves economics is wrong. So there was an article in the Telegraph a week ago about a couple who moved to, I think it was Lichfield. They'd been living abroad. They'd sold their house abroad and they wanted to move to Lichfield. And they couldn't find a house they wanted in Lichfield. They looked at all the estate agents, nothing. And so they reversed the question. Okay. What they did is they found about 5 streets in Lichfield, which were their favourite streets. And then they went on the Zoopla and they ruled out all the houses that they couldn't afford. And then they ruled out the houses they didn't want because they were next to the traffic lights or too small or whatever it might have been. And they wrote a handwritten letter to all the people living in the houses they were prepared to buy. Now, none of those houses were on the market. Okay. None of those houses were on the market. I think 7 people replied, 5 people kind of met them, 3 people said, yep, I'm prepared to sell you the house at the price you offer, and they ended up buying a house. Now, what you're doing there is something different. You're creating rather than exploiting. Now, an economist would go, this is crazy, because anybody willing to sell their house would put their house on the market, and therefore their house would be listed with an estate agent. What I think that experiment proves is for every person whose house is on the market, there are actually 3 or 4, maybe even 6 or 7 people who'd be willing to sell their house at the right offer. And I mean, there are all kinds of psychological reasons for that. I mean, if you think about it, there's a lot of asymmetry in a lot of things, right? Okay, if one of you would probably not spend a load of time trying to chat up Cameron Diaz or something, but if Cameron Diaz wrote to you and said, would you like to go for dinner? Most of you would say, yeah, this is slightly sexist, male-centric. You get my point, okay? Most of you would probably go, yeah, all right, I'll go and have dinner, okay? You know, there's an awful lot of asymmetry going on in the world. And yet economics pretends it away. It assumes that everybody who wants to go to Manchester will go to Manchester by whatever means is most efficient. It assumes that everybody who wants to sell their house will list their house as being for sale. And that just isn't true. There are possibilities out there that you can create alongside the possibilities you can exploit. And we're doing the second job, we're not doing the first. Now, you must all know this, because if you're financial advisors, you know that, yes, there are people who are actively in market for a financial advisor, but actually they're a minority of people. And it's probably quite difficult to find them and so on and so forth. What you have to do as a financial advisor is create more opportunities than you find. And I think it's a really, really interesting job. By the way, I think it's a really important job. I think it's a job which actually everybody gets wrong, both consumers and advisors, in that they think their job is to optimize the wealth of the customer. Actually, I think it's a bit like a personal trainer. The value of a personal trainer isn't, I'm not a great example of this, I grant you. A great personal trainer isn't the person who suggests you shift from doing weights to cardio, or that you take, you start doing spin classes rather than doing Pilates or whatever. The real value of that person is they get you to do something. And the real value of my financial advisor isn't really that he optimizes X versus Y. It's that he provides me with the confidence to act. First of all, he gets me to save something. I work in advertising. Left to my own devices, I'd piss all my money up the wall. Various financial advisors got me to start saving 20, 30 years ago. And as a result, I'm now 58. They go, well, where did all this money come from? And the second thing they do is they give you the confidence and trust to do things which you kind of know might be rational, like pay off your mortgage, but which you can't help feeling, yeah, would I be mad to do this? Would I suffer regret from doing this? Is this a mistake? Is this a sane thing? And they give you the kind of impetus to make a big decision like that, which left to your own devices, you'd actually postpone indefinitely. So I think, the value of this is the value of the relationship with a financial advisor is only partly about optimizing the money you actually save. I think that's a third of it, don't get me wrong, but we make it everything. And that's not really what it's about. A great financial advisor who gets you to save quite well is more valuable than a financial advisor who isn't very persuasive at getting you to save, but when you do save, it's, wonderfully optimal. And so it's rather like the joke that hairdressers are actually they're effectively psychiatrists who cut your hair. A hairdresser is basically a therapist who also cuts your hair. That's always the joke. Actually, the role of financial advisor is a much bigger job, really, than the narrow definition manages to capture.
And thank you for all that. One of the barriers to people taking financial advice and experiencing those benefits you talked about, Rory, is a lack of trust in the sector. The sector over the years.
Yeah.
You and I are old. You and I are old enough to remember the endowment mis-selling scandal. We've had British Steel not so long ago. A couple of weeks ago, Nationwide was told to take some adverts down or rework them. Can you talk about how financial services sector, can build trust and credibility with the people who could benefit from them?
Yeah, I think you've been handed a massive gift here, and nobody's talking about it. Now, everybody at the moment, particularly in marketing, is talking about AI. I think in the last 5 years, there's been another hugely important, really important development in technology, which we've failed to acknowledge, partly because it involves humans, and the whole tech world is obsessed with coming up with solutions that don't involve face-to-face contact. Basically, Silicon Valley is an automation project. And I was talking to someone at Deloitte this morning, and I said, do you ever get someone who comes along with a business where part of the business model now says, we're going to really invest in customer service. We're going to employ really good people on the telephone. We're going to pay them really well. We're going to keep them loyal. We're going to let them work at home so they stay with us for ages and are really experienced. You know what happened? Every single business proposal now is basically a job destruction scheme. And my view is that Zoom, what we're doing now, is now you can't go and evangelize it because it's 20 years old. Okay, you can't kind of go and say, hey, this technology is brilliant, because technically with Skype, it's been around since the late 90s. But that's not what's important about the technology. What's important about the technology is since COVID, it was normalized, and that you can reasonably expect a 68-year-old to know how to make a Zoom call, and it doesn't feel weird anymore. And people don't necessarily see it as, the cheap alternative of a face-to-face meeting. Now, I think the reason that's really important for financial advisors is I think that Zoom, combined with presentation of spreadsheets, slides, etc., is the perfect medium for delivering financial advice. Put bluntly, okay, I don't want my financial advisor to come to my home all the time, right? It's too much hassle. I got to put on a kind of suit. I got to tidy the house. I got to buy coffee and biscuits. I got to get home from work early. I got to make sure my wife's there. We got all the paperwork ready because I don't understand half this stuff, okay? But equally, these are deep decisions which are too deep to be made with the click of a mouse or or over a phone call even, or over email. And I think Zoom is, if you think about it, there's a brilliant chart of how to the ideal mode of transport for a particular journey. And it starts with a sort of, 100 yards, 200 yards, 500 yards, 1,000 yards, a mile, 5 miles, 10 miles, etc. And obviously short journeys, it's walk or wheelchair or whatever it may be, okay? Then you have this very steep, but actually quite narrow spike, which is the bicycle, it's really good for a 2.5 mile journey if it's not raining and if it's on the flat and if you're under 50 years of age and so forth, okay? All right. And then you get obviously you get bus, then you get train. Trains are very, very good either if you're going into a really big city, and they're really, really good if you're going about 200 to 500 miles, basically, okay? And then you get the aeroplane for journeys of 700-800 miles or further, And then overarching, a huge swathe of this is the car, which is pretty damn good if you've got to go 1.5 miles, and it's pretty damn good if you've got to go 250 miles. It covers an unbelievable range of kind of journeys. And my argument is, if you look at modes of communication, media, okay, you've got all these things on the left, like email and, I suppose you've got all these things on the left, like email, or for that matter, WhatsApp or text messages or whatever. They're all kind of variously synchronous or asynchronous, and they're kind of textual and they're kind of brief, but they're low touch. Okay. Then you've got a little bit more personal is the phone call. Okay. And then you have this huge yawning gap between the phone call and the face-to-face meeting, which is big commitment. Okay. It's big effort. It's big investment. Now, the interesting thing there is very simply there is that actually, okay. Now, this is a webinar, so I wouldn't have cancelled this webinar because I realize there are 329 people who'd be a bit disappointed. But if this were just a Zoom call between the two of us and I had to postpone, well, it's no biggie, right? You wouldn't, I would have felt a bit of an arsehole and you might have been slightly peeved. But it's nothing to the extent of you traveling to London and then me saying, I'm terribly sorry, I can't see you. Okay. That's like massive social embarrassment. So there are all these virtues of the Zoom call, which is it's just the right amount of interpersonal action for financial services purposes. There is, by the way, a really interesting business, which I recommend. I am actually, just to declare a small interest, I'm kind of like their official evangelist. It's an Australian business called Meet Magic. And the way it works very simply is, how do you get someone to agree to give you an hour of their time? Well, the way it worked historically in business, the website is meetmagic.org, by the way. Now, the way it worked historically in business is you'd invite them on a golfing day. This is, I'm being a bit 1980s now, but you know what I mean, right? You go and find some entertaining thing. You'd host a conference in a fantastic hotel or resort. You'd invite them there. And out of a sense of kind of obligation and reciprocation, you could then chat to them about financial services or whatever it was, or whatever your company offered. Meet Magic takes this and does it in a very interesting way. It just says, if you're prepared to give us 40 minutes of your time on Zoom, we'll donate £200, £500 to charity, the charity of your choice. And so you know several things. You know they're serious because they're paying money to have the conversation. In a way, you know it can't be a complete waste of time because even if it goes nowhere, well, you've given £200 to your favourite charity. And also, you know they're going to put in a professional effort in presenting to you. They're going to make an effort because, this isn't just a case of a junior tire kicker finding a prospect and then hammering on about the value of investment. They've actually made a decision to talk to you. And that strikes me as a really, really interesting concept. In a sense, you could argue the whole advertising industry shows that there is a value on people's time and attention. Well, you can't, in a business context, you can't actually bribe people. If I went to a company and said, I'd like to talk to you about advertising and here's 500 quid in a brown envelope for half an hour of your time, that's illegal. And actually, the economy would be more efficient if you're allowed to do that, by the way, but you're not. Okay. And there's a good reason why not, because it then spirals out of control. Okay. But the whole principle of there's £200 to a charity of your choice if you're just happy to listen to me strikes me as an extraordinary way to monetize attention, but also there's a guarantee of a high quality conversation because the person is invested in actually having the meeting. This isn't just a case of speculative time wasting, tire kicking through, well, I've got this lead, I might as well hammer the hell out of it. It actually suggests, look, we wouldn't be doing this if we didn't think there was a high probability that we were a good match.
And that leads on to something else that I want to talk about, or I want you to talk about, because nobody's here to listen to me today, they're here to listen to you, Rory. And that's the disconnect between the life-changing benefits of financial advice and financial planning.
Yeah, which I only recognise at the age of 58, by the way. I spent about 25 of my years thinking, what a pain, why am I paying all this money in? And then suddenly you're 58, you go, geez, I have options. Yeah. I might make the point, I'm going to make a political point here, by the way, which is I do think that the tax system is absurdly weighted to the benefit of the elderly, in that we tax income, we don't tax wealth, we don't tax capital gains on property, okay? Most of the NHS is redistributing wealth from wage earners who don't get ill to retired people who do. And then now I'm nearing retirement, I keep being told, well, you can take your money out of your pension tax-free, live off that for a bit, pay much more of your current salary into your pension and effectively get a double dose of tax relief. And I must admit, half of my reaction was, wow, that's great. And the other half of my reaction was, where were all these tax breaks when I was 32, had 2 kids and really needed the money? Okay, 35, I had kids, actually. Okay. And so there is, by the way, I think there is a serious point to be made, which is that we are absurdly over generous, because I mean, one of the problems I have. Okay, this is really contentious here. You weren't expecting this. One of the problems of pensions is it allows people to stay in homes which are far bigger than they need. Okay, so my brother lives in Berkshire, and basically 80% of the people on their road are childless empty nesters living in 5-bedroom homes, either alone or with one other partner. What that means is there's £1 trillion worth of wealth sitting in property, basically sitting inert in property. Meanwhile, the people living in those properties are worried about the price of a lemon and are going to Lidl, to get the sort of. Now, I never envisaged when I was a kid a world in which millionaires were skimping on buying lemons, but you have actually seen this utter absurdity. So one of the most important things I think you might be able to do is actually persuade people to downsize, because we already have the property we need. It's just in the wrong hands. I mean, this strikes me. I mean, okay, I work in advertising. Okay, one of the reasons I quite like redistribution of wealth is that when you give money to poorer people, they spend it, and when you give money to rich people, they hoard it. All right. Now, one thing I do feel very passionately is that partly because of the failures of trust in the financial services industry, the property industry in the UK has become the financial services industry for many, many people. Okay, so basically, instead of having a really big pension, they've ended up in a really big house. Property is a terrible investment. Now you're going to say, hold on, I made a fortune on my house. Yeah. If you've got a load of shares and you're going to Lidl to buy your lemons, and and only at 8 o'clock when the lemons are sold off cheaply, okay. If you've got a load of shares, you can sell some of those shares and buy better lemons. And you don't have to move house or have a massive loss of status or any of those problems. Property is an awful way for people to accumulate wealth, because the realization, if you want to make that wealth liquid, okay, I guess that there's obviously equity release, which is not entirely brilliant, because it's basically remortgaging your house, okay. But I mean, in some ways, what we've done here, because of the failure of people to invest in meaningful, productive economic activity, is we've allowed people to basically treat a land speculation bubble as the principal source of their savings and wealth. And it's a very, very bad form in which to hold wealth, actually. You might argue a second home is better, because you can sell a second home, but your first home is a terrible way to have wealth.
So how do we connect? How do the people on this call, the advisors, the planners, connect with more people like you in your 30s, and how do they demonstrate the benefits of working with them?
One thing I believe in strongly here is I think employers have a big role. You saw the extraordinary success of the opt-out pension. I think that one of the things you can do, I mean, obviously it's complicated because there is such a profusion. There is a famous thing called the paradox of choice, which is you have so many competing financial entities competing for your attention that you basically become blinded by the headlights and you end up doing nothing. If you had a simple choice, which is you either, let's imagine there was kind of monopolistic. I mean, interestingly, there might be a two-phase solution, which is, I mean, I'm riffing here, okay, just to accept the fact, which is that the government encourages you to save. That goes into a boring savings pot, and you can decide to engage with investment advisors with that savings pot. But the first point is you create a pot of savings. The second thing I do, by the way, is I'd redesign the pension legally to allow people to draw down money or borrow against it at a low rate of interest. Let me explain, okay? It isn't realistic, okay? When I'm 55, I'm now 58. There's an awful lot about my future I kind of know. I don't know about my health, my state of health. That's a random variable. I don't know my longevity. It's a random variable. But I'm probably not going to be selected, to play for the Manchester United first team. I think that's a realistic kind of thing I can write off. There are an awful lot of future life possibilities which have basically been narrowed down. Basically know, health and other things, I basically know what I'm going to do. When you're 25, you haven't got a clue what's going to happen, okay? You might even argue, okay, that when you're 25, it's not a great idea to save because your principal motivation is securing a high quality life partner. Okay, now, all right. And so spending money on dating, which may look irrational to a financial advisor, might not be a bad investment. Okay, right. But there's so many uncertainties when you're 25, 30 that the idea that you put this money away and you don't see it until you're 55. Now, when you're 25, being 55 is like, it's science fiction. It's like being on another planet. When you're 45, you start to think that way. When you're 50, you definitely do. Okay. But having some sort of system where, look, you're saving this money, but you can draw it down if you need to, a deposit on a house, if you need to move to Latvia, if you need to get divorced. Okay, I mean, it could, okay, there's so many random uncertainties here that having a pension that has no kind of short-term value, it only has long-term value, is a fundamental failure in the design of the product. Okay. Now, I mean, if you'd said, okay, the great thing is that, I mean, this is why I say that the property is a very bad investment, because you literally have people who are living in £1 million house, but they can't replace the shock absorbers on their car. All right. Now, in the same way, you don't want to be that person who has a fantastic pension, but you actually, you can't afford to replace your washing machine. And so having some sort of what you might call mixture in a pension of long-term benefit and short-term benefit would seem to me such an obvious idea. And yet it's been designed really by economists. And economists are not really like human beings. They're kind of anally retentive, kind of wealth optimizers who don't really know how ordinary people think.
Dan, we've got some comments coming in on Rory's manifesto for changing pensions. Do you want to look at some of
There is an
those?
idea, by the way, I will share from a guy who's a certain, absolute genius business writer called Roger L. Martin, a Canadian business writer. And I agree with the point about ISAs being such. That is fair. But having a separate, I mean, equally, you could design an ISA somehow where you could borrow against it, for example, and you could have an ISA credit card with a lower rate of interest, couldn't you? I mean, which is secured on the basis of your ISA. That's a fair point. It is accessible. But Roger Martin actually thinks that one way you could solve this problem is he actually thinks instead of making the first £10,000 you earn every year tax-free, he actually proposed, and there was a Canadian political party which got interested but didn't get elected, that the first £100,000 you earn in your life should be tax-free, and after that you're taxed on everything. And he argues that if you front-weighted earnings, you would actually inculcate a really good savings mentality in people. It's a very, very interesting thought. I mean, as a policy thought, I have to say, it's a really, really interesting thought experiment.
It's a good example of your innovative thinking.
Yeah, he's a very, very interesting guy, Roger Martin. I thought that was fantastic.
Dan, let's have some questions. I've seen one coming from Guy going from
I like that comment, by the way. Creating demand is all about being helpful. There's an awful lot to this, which is, about reciprocation. Actually, you're right that actually, if you can, where you do have a problem, undoubtedly, is that the real benefits, people mentally don't understand the compounding effect. I mean, really, our brains and it's a bit complicated actually, but we've been trained at school to think linearly, and the compounding effect takes me by surprise. Now, the one consequence, for example, is the APR interest rate, which is annual. Now, I would argue that APR serves to make borrowing seem cheaper than it really is, and investment seem less exciting than it really is. Now, at the moment, if you have a savings product, you have to say 2.3% APR. Okay. If you're allowed to say double your money in X years, I think far more people would take up that product. But as it is, for purposes of comparison, you have to advertise everything on the basis of its APR, and that understates the compounding effect of saving, and actually understates the compounding effect of borrowing. So in some ways, it's doubly misleading, I think.
Dan, let's have some questions.
Right, I'd like to go for David's question, actually. David asks, we talked earlier about creating demand from consumers. How would Rory approach that?
Yeah, I mean, it is a really interesting question, which is how you create, and it's also it's very difficult because, it's very moment driven, actually. Yes, in one sense, you have target markets, you have target audiences. But the thing you've also got to spot is the target moment, in that there are vast swathes of people's lives where they don't want to engage with any of this stuff. And if you catch someone at the right moment, then they're very, very engaged and very, very keen to do more. And that moment thing, there's a very funny thing. I've got a friend who's an expert in philanthropy. And so obviously he targets people who've just sold a massive business, say. And the interesting thing he learned is that you don't approach them asking them to be philanthropic when they sell their business. When they sell their business, they go and buy a massive house in France and they go around the world and they do all the things they promised they do when they sell the business. You wait a year or maybe 2 years when they've got bored with all that stuff, and then you come in and ask them to do some philanthropy. And I think there are very similar things there that you have to catch someone at exactly the right moment, which is what makes it so difficult. And we've noticed this, that banks, I think, banks believe that they had this fantastic possibility to cross sell, and they haven't really succeeded in that much, have they? Not nearly in the extent to which you might expect.
Dan, do you want to keep going with your questions?
Yeah, I've got a couple. I'm picking a few that
The point, by the way, that there's no education about this stuff in schools is absolutely right. The extent to which, one thing I always say actually is get your kids to work in a shop or in a restaurant, because it's like a free MBA, because you learn everything about a business kind of in microcosm. But the extent to which we allow people to leave school, literate, but and numerate, but financially illiterate, really, really well. I'll tell you a story about this, which I know from my marketing experience. I knew somebody who was, back in the day, and I can mention them because the brand no longer exists. He was the marketing director of Rumbelows, and they did some research which showed that when they were advertising the APR on which you could buy, say, a washing machine or a television, I hope it wasn't the majority of their customer base, but it was a large double-digit group of their customer base thought the bigger the APR, the better the deal. So they'd walk past a branch of Rumbelows and see 27% APR, and they go, "That's brilliant! Dixon's is only offering me 50." That's just an example of how terrifying this is.
Right, the next question I'm going to ask is perhaps a slightly incendiary question from Guy, who asks what your thoughts are on people not being able to buy cigarettes if they're born beyond 2009.
It's actually quite clever. I mean, the New Zealand government adopted it, then actually the government fell, so I think it was never enacted. It's not a crazy idea, because there is a difference in restricting people from starting something and telling people they can't do something that they used to do. Some Conservative MPs sort of actually voted against it on an interesting point of principle, which is that generally in government, we don't discriminate on the basis of age. Okay, and that if you're allowed to do something at 49, you should be allowed to do something at 23. Obviously, there are questions of age of majority and 18 and all that sort of stuff. But I mean, there's an interesting, there are some really interesting questions there, which, I mean, it's not a totally crazy thing. I mean, it at least shows someone thinking differently. Now, one of my big beefs about the tax system is it doesn't discriminate between someone who's earned £200,000 a year for 10 years in a row. Okay. Now, you might argue, if you've been earning £200,000 a year for 10 years in a row, well, you probably might, maybe you can afford to pay 45% tax on the top increment. Okay. What happens if you're a teacher and you've worked all your life as a teacher, and then you make it up to deputy headmaster, and for the last 3 years of your working life, you finally get into the, a lot of headmasters would be in the 40% tax band. I don't know about the 45% tax band. Some probably, actually, a really large school. To some extent, that 3 years of high earnings is a reward for all your past work. and it's only going to happen to you for 3 years in your life. Is it fair that the rate of tax you pay on a year's income doesn't make any acknowledgement of what you've earned in previous years? So maybe this principle that we don't discriminate on age is actually kind of wrong. That, you know, it's, you know, for many people, it's always struck me as strange how many people are opposed to the 40% tax rate, even though most people don't pay it, until you realize that most people are either hoping to pay it one day, and indeed many people will pay it one day later in their life, or you run a business like you're a scaffolder and you just have 2 fantastic years, you know, because someone's building some enormous thing next to you and you get the contract. And it does seem to be that we should make a distinction between, you know, 3 years at the end of your life where you finally get promoted to headmaster versus being, you know, someone running some hugely lucrative business making a fortune for 25 years. And we don't make that distinction. We treat every single year's earnings as a snapshot. I mean, the guys, they're saying we don't let people. There is an argument that you could tax property on the extent to which there are unnecessary rooms in it. I mean, council tax is massively regressive in that you will pay more council tax on a £250,000 house in Barnsley than you will do in many cases in a kind of £1 million house in Westminster. It's unbelievably stupid as a system. And actually, do we need taxes that get old people to downsize? Yeah, I kind of think we do, actually. I'm not even sure they wouldn't be better off downsizing. You know, the last thing you want to be is elderly in a house that's really expensive to maintain and really expensive to heat. And actually, families, if you think about it, are, if you look at the allocation of family houses, families are right at the bottom, right? So you, let's say you've got a big house, okay? The biggest likelihood is that 2 retired people live in it. Then there's a chance that it's student accommodation, or that you've split it into 5, okay, and you're renting out to 5, you know, to 5 bedsit people, right? Because you can make more money. A family is outbid by students. A family is out-wealthed by old people. Then you have also things like, you know, migration, where people who are coming over to earn a lot of money for a short amount of time are happy doing things called, you know, hot bunking, where they just share a property between lots and lots of people. Okay. The family home, the family is about number 5 on the list. We had a case, I'm telling this story because it's just an extraordinary reflection on how bonkers the property industry was. We were looking to move from Canary Wharf back into London. This is our offices at Ogilvy. And one of the 3 properties we were looking at was this new sort of cylindrical building being built near Waterloo Station. And one day I came along to the meeting and it had just dropped off the list. And I said, what happened to that cylindrical thing near Waterloo? And they said, oh, the developers decided it was more profitable as student housing. I thought, hold on, you're like, we're like the 4th biggest advertising agency in London and we're outbid by a bunch of students. I mean, do you want to know what we really need? And nobody's going to like this. What we really need is trailer parks. Now, let me just explain. Okay, the phrase trailer park is a marketing disaster. Okay, I'll freely admit this. We need to find a way in which people can invest in a place to live without placing a massive bet on land value. Because most of the value in a property is not the house. It's the land and the planning permission. That's the value. Combination of land and planning permission. And what's unfair is, okay, if you have a boom in something like tech stocks, or you have a boom like the Dutch tulip boom of the 17th century, that doesn't really matter because I can get by without tulips, okay, and I can get by without tech stocks, right? I can't get by without a place to live. And what we need is property for people who don't want to invest the greater part of their wealth in land. And so the trailer park will be a system where, you know, you get a really, really good design. You get Johnny Ive to design some really, really interesting form of mobile housing. And you could basically, you know, go to a pub car park and the pub car park could give you permission to go and live it, you know, to live there. You know, without the usual building problems. The other thing can I tell a terrible thing about this, which is, as someone who loves technology, and you know, it's good that consumers have money to spend on new technology because it brings new benefits. Okay, The thing that's always worried me about the people who own a £1.3 million house in Fulham is this, right? What's the point of being rich in 2024 if 80% of your expenditure consists of buying something which you could own if you were poor in 1924? Okay, right. Okay. Now, in 1924, that 3-bedroom house in Fulham, there would have been a postman living there, right? Right. It might have been somebody who worked, there might have been a middle-class railway clerk, okay, but it was nobody like super rich, right? And you're literally spending all this money. So one of the interesting things you will face, I think, is I'm permanently baffled by how few Londoners actually take the cash and move out, particularly with the possibilities of flexible working. Because you go, is it really worth, in other words, you're paying, I don't know, £500,000 basically to be in London. Now, there are upsides to being in London. There are downsides. I would argue personally that the relative upsides of living in London versus a nice country town are much, much smaller. If you're over the age of 30 and you're married, okay, they're much, much smaller than they were 30 years ago because of things like the internet, okay? When I was a kid, I grew up in a Welsh market town, Monmouth, near Monmouth. If you wanted to buy interesting hi-fi equipment, if you wanted to buy obscure records, if you wanted to go and see a Korean film, you had to go, London or Bristol at a pinch, right? You had to go somewhere much bigger. All of that stuff is universally available in the UK. You can live in Aberystwyth, you can go and watch a Korean film on Netflix. You can go and order an obscure book from Amazon. You can go and order a Michelin-starred meal from the Isle of Wight. Actually, it's called UB Chef. Okay, and a Michelin-starred chef actually makes you the meal and posts it to you at Aberystwyth. Okay, the deficit for living, and actually also I'd say I went to Manchester in 1989 from London, and let me tell you, even Manchester was total shit. Okay, compared to London in 1989. I mean, genuinely, there was probably a good music scene. I didn't know about all that, but apart from that, it was a dump. In terms of like artisan bakeries and coffee shops and all that other stuff, that's completely leveled out now. In fact, arguably, you get more interesting restaurants and food in sort of, I've got a little flat in East Kent. You get more interesting food in Margate than you do in London because the property is cheaper, so people can afford to experiment. That is something which I find internally fascinating. The fact that people in London don't just go, shit, I've basically had a pools win, I've had a lottery win here. But now, okay, look at it backwards. Here's a nice little persuasive technique. Okay, so I had this friend. This always fascinates me, the story. The friend of mine had a friend who, he was born in Norfolk, she was born in London. They were both teachers. They both bought flats in London when they were early working in the late 80s, early 90s. Okay. Then when they got together, they sold their flats and bought an F-off house when you could still afford to, somewhere like Clapham. It's now worth like 1.4 million. He wants to move back to Norfolk. She wants to stay in London. Okay. Now, someone asked me to kind of adjudicate. She can't envisage not living in London. He says, look, with our money from our house, we could buy a much nicer house in Norfolk and never work again. Okay, if we did, or we could teach in Norfolk and still have unbelievable holidays, right? So I can't leave London. Now, the only point I made is, can you imagine someone in Norfolk, okay, living in a nice house in Norfolk, they suddenly win the lottery and they get 1.3 million quid and they go, that's brilliant because we can move to a really shitty house in London and work for the rest of our lives, right? Okay. Can you imagine it happening in reverse? You can't, can you? No one would do that. So there's something there about status quo bias. This is why I recommend you do read all the Daniel Kahneman books, because you have all these little things like loss aversion, status quo bias, etc. The endowment effect, he's absolutely right. Paul, absolutely spot on. I've got this place in London. And then you have this terror, of course, that people who feel that if they move out of London, first of all, what if property prices double again? I'll feel like I've missed out. And they also feel they'd never be able to move back again, which is a sort of rational fear, I suppose. Yeah.
Let's do some quick fire marketing questions.
Of course, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Coming through. Yeah, let's go for some of those. Let's tick some of those off.
Right, I'm dying to ask Philip's question. Philip asks, I'd be interested to get Rory's thoughts on prospecting. If he had 1 year to get 100 clients, how would he go about doing it?
That's a really interesting question. One of the things is actually build in a little negative, find a little negative to flip into a positive. So one of the a bit of work. Hi, Justin. Excellent. One of the Justin is my financial advisor, by the way, and I partly chose him because of the excellence of his Zoom setup. He's got an absolutely fantastic professional webcam setup. So I would copy Justin in that. In that I go and invest in an SLR cameras, a webcam, ring lights, all that stuff, you know, because that's the new a brilliant phrase by American .com entrepreneur sent to me. He said, you know, your webcam setup is your $2,000 Italian suit of the 2020s, you know. I would prospect over Zoom simply because of the extraordinary efficiency of it. And the lower degree of commitment. So I'd really focus on that as a channel. I'd also look for Robert Cialdini and various people have always said that there's a sort of thing where if you say there's one thing I don't do, you know, I mean, you could sell yourself as being, you know, actually quite boring because everybody else sells themselves on being able to outperform the market. And if you actually sold yourself on the losers game, has anybody read this paper? It's famously called the losers game. It's a famous paper in financial services. And I had a friend who worked for, oh God, one of the investment firms. And I should remember which one it was. It was not Lazard, but it was one of the other ones. He said every other financial firm is trying to be in the top 10 all the time or in the top 5. And he said, actually, we have a different approach, okay? What we regard as successful is we're not in the bottom half for 10 years in a row. That's our definition of success. You could adopt an interesting philosophy, which is rather like the barbell approach that Nassim Taleb advocates, which is we're going to split your wealth into 2, okay? This is the stuff you can't afford to lose, okay? And that is almost copying from bees. Okay, this is exploit. This is the stuff we can't afford to lose. We absolutely need this. Then we'll take 10% and we'll put it into things which have finite downside and potentially limitless upside, which is Nassim Taleb's point, you know. And you could actually, that would be a very, but having a kind of distinctive philosophy. I always thought that philosophy, like, I mean, it wasn't PIMCO. It was where did he work before PIMCO? I'm trying to remember what it was. But I thought that was a brilliant investment philosophy. No. When we, you know, we're not trying to be in the top 10. That's actually slightly meaningless. And as we all know, quite often the way you get into the top 10 in one year is by having a living catastrophe the next year. We're never in the bottom half is an absolutely brilliant sort of distinguishing feature. The other one is, I suppose, one thing with Justin I'd be very grateful about is much more conversation about wider life goals, because so much of this conversation is about simply everybody talks as if it's simply a wealth optimization problem. Okay, this is just, okay, you've got wealth, you need more of it. All right, well, one, there's tax efficiency, which you know is hardly irrelevant. Okay, but then there are far bigger questions like that, like, let's be honest, what kind of retirement do you want? Now, some people will want to give up work. They hate their job. They see retirement as the reward for their years of hard work. They want a high degree of self-indulgence. Other people may be actually quite happy with a modest retirement. And so asking philosophical questions like that, because after all, the biggest question anybody probably, the big question is, are you prepared to downsize? And I have this fascinating issue at the moment with 2 people, sort of family members, who are skint, but absolutely paranoid about the idea of downsizing to a completely irrational extent. And so, really important philosophical questions like that are actually really interesting. Lovely bit of financial advice, by the way, which is fascinating. Okay, this is about how bad it is to invest heavily in your primary residence. You might argue that buying a secondary residence isn't that crazy, because if you need to sell it, you can sell it, and in a few weeks, and you've got the money. You don't have to move house. But the primary residence, this is Elizabeth Warren, who's actually the Democratic senator for Massachusetts. She wrote a book called The Double Income Trap. And she argues that actually what has happened, and I think this is broadly speaking true, is that the fact that now most households are double income households, most of the gains from that haven't gone into consumption. They've just gone into rising property prices. The government's done brilliantly out of double income households, okay, because they get twice as much tax. The property market did very well out of them because suddenly you had two incomes to pay for a house. Houses in great school districts in the US. Unfortunately, even you could argue both women and men didn't do very well out of it because most of the incremental wealth went into buying a house, which was now twice as expensive. Elizabeth Warren rather amusingly says, actually, you're better off going and buying a hot tub and taking a cruise than buying a really expensive house. I thought it was very strange financial advice. She said, no, because if one of you loses your job, if you have a problem, okay, you can stop buying hot tubs. You can stop going on cruises, okay? You can turn the hot tub heating off and just let it freeze over, okay? But if you've got a really expensive mortgage, no escape. And it's actually an interesting, it is an interesting point, but I mean, it does terrify me because everybody goes safe as houses, which is sort of true, but actually your primary residence being your principal source of wealth accumulation is a psychological disaster. It's also an economic disaster. I mean, the economy would be better off, okay, if, you know, my parents-in-law sold their house and basically, you know, spent the money, I don't know, you know, on crack or going, you know, stock car racing or something. You know, that would actually be better for the economy. I'm not sure it'd be morally preferable. But in terms of having this extraordinary repository of wealth tied up in this totally inert asset, it's a disaster. You can't eat bricks, exactly.
Dan, we're drawing to a close. Do you want to pick one final question for Rory? Have you got a killer question from the audience?
So one other thing I would do is I would actually teach people psychological wealth management. There's a very good colleague of mine in the advertising industry who always says, we got everything wrong in advertising. So we never paid people that well, okay? But we gave them amazing company cars and, you know, a big expense account. And as he said, the job of the employer isn't to make your employees rich, it's to make them feel rich, okay? And if you've got a blinged up car and you know, you go to a good 5-star hotel occasionally. But one thing I think that is important is actually helping people reframe what wealth is, because when the conversation is just about kind of, you know, a numerical question of wealth accumulation, that's not a very interesting conversation. Whereas if you said, you know, not only am I going to help you be rich, I'm going to help you live richly. In other words, these are areas where you can spend, which I think are pretty good. Okay, you know, what are the things you should actually buy in terms of goods that really pay back? So actually getting into kind of which consumer advice territory is a really interesting distinguishing area. So if you, I bought, I bought effectively, wealth is what you're left with if you lose all your money, is kind of true. I mean, I bought one of these things, you know, I mean, actually we're faced with this absolute kind of complete absurd choice of consumer goods. Some of which, to be honest, you know, are yogurt makers. They end up in the back of the cupboard. There are other things where you wish you'd bought them 5 years before. And actually, a financial advisor who had really good data on the products that really delivered lifetime happiness. There's a book called Happy Money by Michael Norton at Harvard. Would be a really interesting approach to financial advice. I bought one of those things at Quooker. You know, it's boiling water from your tap. Okay. Now, when I did it, it was partly because my wife was doing up the kitchen. I thought, well, I've got to have a gadget out of this. It can't just be work surfaces. So I've actually, you know, half of you goes, God, I'm spending 800 quid on a kettle. You know, this is insane. Actually, once you have one of those things, they're absolutely magical. It's, you know, you never go back. Japanese toilet, same thing. Okay, so that will be a really, really interesting financial advisor who actually advises you, the famous FT magazine, How to Spend It. Actually saying, look, these things are actually, you know, life enhancing. These things are actually pretty trivial, you know. I think that would be really, really fun.
Right,
Well,
let's
the Happy Money book is called Happy Money, and it's co-authored by a guy called Michael Norton, who I think is at Harvard Business School. He's just written another book, I think this is one of his, called The Ritual Effect. There you go. Which is also probably an interesting read. But I'm so glad that behavioral science has got into this world, because it was turning into a kind of mathematical conundrum, and actually that's not what it's about at all, really.
let's leave on one practical question then. And I think David's question is probably that. So David asks, as a small company with a small budget,
Yeah.
what channels would you prioritize when marketing?
I definitely regard Zoom as an epiphany, because I know I keep going on about this, but I really think it's that important, because I think, funnily enough, in the AI world, I think personal service will take on an altogether new value, because it will be, in a way, how you distinguish yourself. And this is not an area, I think this is an area which is too personal. There's too much money at stake for it to be simply left to kind of accountants and economists. There's too much personal preference at stake. People are too different. One of the worst crimes of economics. Has anybody read Gary's Economics? The guy Gary Stevenson, who wrote the book The Trading Game. Yeah. I mean, he's really interesting. And one of the points he makes, which I totally agree with him on, is that the single representative agent models in economics, which treat an average as representative of the whole, is an absolutely terrible model, because it doesn't capture inequality, because you can't have inequality within a single person. It doesn't capture the fact that when you put up interest rates, it affects two classes of people in completely different ways. It doesn't affect the fact that with quantitative easing, you make the rich massively richer and other people poorer. Okay. So I think the point he makes there is really, really interesting. This is too big a decision to be made remotely. Now, I'll tell you a lovely story about that. I mentioned the thing, the Quooker, okay, that funny little tap that produces boiling water on demand. I'd really recommend them, okay? And so I got in touch with them and said, look, we're having the kitchen done, we're interested. And they said, well, we can give you a demonstration in our showroom. And I said, well, where's your showroom? It's in Manchester. And I said, no, I'm really keen on this tap, but I'm not sure I'm going to take a day up and travel to Manchester to actually go and visit your showroom. They said, no, it's all virtual. And they got me, and actually my wife was slightly indifferent, but my daughter was really keen on one of these things. So they got the buying unit, me and my daughter. This is another really important point with Zoom. The buying unit, of course, is the household to some extent, or it's the couple. It's not the individual. So getting the two people together, and we sat there, and they went and took us around. They had about 6 cameras set up and all this stuff, and they showed us. Go and ask them. Actually, go. I don't want to bombard them, but go and ask Quooker for a demonstration of their tap online. Okay. And it's a really, really beautiful example. The other thing is, there are great people. YouTube, Jimmy Carr said the other day, YouTube became the biggest TV station in the world. Nobody noticed. There are brilliant, brilliant financial people on YouTube. Okay. If I were a financial advisor, I'd find the best of those people or the best of those clips, and I'd just send them out to my client base. Because okay, has anyone watched James Hoffman on coffee on YouTube? Okay, he was the world champion barista. I'm wary to get you into it, because you'll be 3 hours later, you'll be going and spending 1,500 quid on a coffee grinder whose burrs are handcrafted by Lithuanian nuns. I mean, it is a kind of spiral, a rabbit hole into insanity. But what's fascinating about it is the right presentational skills, something of just infinite fascination. And I keep discovering people on YouTube. There's a brilliant piece someone posted, which is, why buy to let is now a mug's game, basically. Okay. And this guy, he's in a kind of kitchen with 3 lights behind him. You probably know who I'm talking about, do you? But he just has the capacity to, okay, if you told me that, 5 years before, that I'd be sitting there captivated watching a financial advisor talk about something, I would think, come on, you can dress things up, but but the very best practitioners of this stuff, it's sheer genius, the capacity that some people have just to completely captivate you with what seems like a kind of arcane and technical topic. And they've done all the work preparing the graphics and everything else. So I'd use those guys.
Thank you so much, Rory. There's a lot of love coming through the chat for you. Quite a few offers of dinner as well. Dinners and drinks, Roy.
What's
And
this? Oh,
we're offering you bedrooms, dinners, drinks, all sorts of things, Roy. And
oh,
Roy,
fantastic.
thank you so much
It's a pleasure.
for spending an hour with us today. It's been an incredible, insightful hour. We'll be sending a recording of this out to everybody who registered for today's session. I should just do a little ad for our next month's webinar. Abby will kill me if I don't. So 10 a.m. Wednesday, the 22nd of May, everything you need to know about client surveys in 2024. 4 reasons you should run them. Consumer duty is not one of those, by the way. The questions you should ask, how you should maximize responses, and most importantly, the 10 things you should do with your client survey results. In the meantime, thanks, Abby. Thanks, Dan. Most of all, thank you, Rory. It's been a fabulous hour. I am off to Google Japanese toilets.
Absolutely.
Cheers,
Thanks
Rory.
so much.
See you
All the
soon.
best. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye. Bye-bye.